Hi, I'm Dr. Sarah-Nicole Bostan, clinical health psychologist and director of behavior change strategy at Signos. Do you feel stressed? If so, you're not alone. Everyone around you is affected by stress. In fact, our modern world is slowly killing us through stress. What do I mean? Well, there's good news and bad news. The good news is that the human life expectancy today has doubled from 200 years ago. Wealthy Europeans between 1500 and 1800 used to only live to their 30s and 40s, but today the average global life expectancy is around 70 years old. The bad news: animals, famine, the plague, they're not our problems anymore. With modern advances in technology and medicine, people undoubtedly live longer. But this comes at a cost. We've prevented death, but we've also expanded how long we live with disease. Some of the top sources of disability today include obesity, diabetes, chronic pain, depression, anxiety, and severe mental illness. And these diseases are increasing at a rate of 50% in the last 30 years. And they're actually all related. For example, research shows a person with depression is at 58% increased risk of becoming obese, while a person who's obese has a 53% increased risk of becoming depressed. There's even a part of the US that the CDC has coined the diabetes belt, where 644 counties across 15 states in the Southeast have significantly higher rates of obesity and diabetes, specifically type 2 diabetes. This same geographic region of the US also happens to have the highest use of psychiatric medications in the country, with more than 1 in 5 people taking at least one prescribed psychiatric medication. So, what exactly is going on here? In my opinion, which is increasingly supported by a growing body of cardiometabolic research, we've out-engineered ourselves. Our body was designed to hoard energy, glucose specifically, for times of emergency. And we've survived a lot of emergencies throughout history because of our body's ability to use glucose right when we need it, store that glucose away when we don't need it, and unpack it again at a moment's notice. But the threats we face today are more subtle and nuanced in the form of stress, though our body still interprets this as a life or death situation and responds accordingly. Glucose, in case you didn't know, is our body and brain's main source of fuel. And it's a good thing we need for survival, really to do any action at all. It's the simplest form of sugar, or the molecule that carbohydrates, both simple and complex, are broken down into so our body can use it as energy. Glucose is responsible for your ability to perceive a subjective sense of readiness and energy to move physically, but also glucose crosses the blood-brain barrier and feeds your brain, giving you the ability to think, plan, organize, make decisions, problem solve, remember things, communicate effectively, and pay attention to whatever's most important in the moment. Unfortunately, our body was designed to hoard glucose, like I said, in case of life-threatening situations, so we'd have the energy to get out of those situations and survive. But today, glucose is everywhere. The standard American diet is overflowing with simple carbohydrates, which flood our bloodstream with way more glucose than we need, quite frankly, which then gets stored away in our fat cells because our brain assumes we're going to need to use it as energy later. But just as critically as food, and usually forgotten, is the role of stress here. We can be eating the most natural, colorful, nutrient-dense whole foods and still be producing excess glucose. Why is this? Because there's a bidirectional relationship between stress and glucose, which I'll get to in a minute. But why do I even care about this? Well, like I said, I'm a clinical health psychologist and biofeedback researcher who's seen the challenges of the modern world slowly harming my patients. It's very subtle at first, and usually doesn't get people in the door for medical care because we live in a very reactive versus proactive system of care. What do I mean? You might have experienced it yourself. I know I have. Our current healthcare system is set up to put out fires, not to prevent them. I know because I worked in major hospitals across the country training as a health psychologist for the last decade. Obesity and diabetes run in my family. But what we know about these challenges is they're far more modifiable than previously thought. Sure, you can have a genetic predisposition to these issues, but depending on your behaviors, you can also do things that move you toward or away from them. This is known as the diathesis stress model of disease. But back to the point on stress and its connection to our metabolism. Our modern stressors are not the same ones our brain and body has adapted to. We don't typically run away from bears on a daily basis, forage for food, or build our own shelter. We spend far less energy than our body was designed for, but our brains still continue to interpret stressors as serious, life threatening situations, which surges glucose through our bloodstream, doesn't get used as energy, and gets stored as fat. But before we villainize stress, it is important to note that some stress can actually be good for us. What do you mean? Well, number one, it improves alertness and focus on what's happening right now. Number two, stress can enhance performance ability. Number three, some stress provides a little memory boost. Number four, stress allows for some personal growth. Number five, stress has immunoprotective effects, meaning a little bit of stress actually helps protect us from more serious illnesses, kind of like how vaccines work, where our body receives a little bit of whatever disease we're being vaccinated against, and then remembers that template and knows what to do with it later so we don't get even more sick. And lastly, a little bit of stress can remind us we care about whatever is happening, which is actually what makes us human. The problem isn't really those acute, one-off little stressors. Those are actually pretty helpful. I've regularly reminded my patients that my wish for them isn't to eliminate all their stressors, but to help them better manage their stressors so their bodies don't go into overdrive. The threat to our cardiometabolic and whole health is chronic stress, which leads to all kinds of things like neuroinflammation, physiological disruption across basically any bodily area you might choose to measure, like glucose, insulin, cortisol, heart rate variability, muscle tension, bodily temperature, sweat, brain activity, and a lot more. So, how can we make sense of glucose and stress? Well, Robert Sapolsky, a Stanford neuroscientist and endocrinologist who studies stress metabolism and the diseases that stress can cause, actually wrote a whole book on this very topic back in 1998. It's called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. So this is not a new topic by any means. It's just getting a lot more traction recently because of the new opportunities for each of us to monitor our stress and physiology through wearables like continuous glucose monitors before we end up with a chronic disease. So to understand why stress management isn't just feel-good lip service from your friendly neighborhood therapist, hi, we first have to understand how stress influences glucose regulation in our body. Without a whole biology lesson, I already mentioned that when we have more glucose in our bloodstream than we need, it gets stored away in our fat cells for later use. You can think of this process like going to the bank. You can go to the bank to take your precious cash and tuck it away in your savings account or in a vault so you can tap into that savings on a rainy day. To highlight a point Sapolsky makes, the rich don't walk around with their millions in their pockets, right? Way too risky. Glucose is basically the same. It's our body and brain's cash. When there's too much glucose, amino acids, and fatty acids floating around, they get deposited in the vault for later in their more complex forms: triglycerides, glycogen, and proteins. Insulin is like your body's bank teller who transports your cash into the savings vault. He's very good at taking your savings to the vault and getting it from the vault when you actually need to use it. He's a pretty chipper guy and quickly does his job. Sometimes insulin even anticipates that you're coming to the bank if you tend to go to the bank at a certain time of day and starts going to the vault before you even get there, particularly if you're eating meals at a certain time of day regularly or having a mild stressor happen around the same time every day. Insulin likes to predict your needs and hops right to it. The problem is, when we're stressed all the time, the bank teller insulin gets worn out because we've been sending him back and forth to and from the savings vault to get our cash to use. He doesn't even know if he's coming or going anymore. So insulin stops working for you. He's still there at the bank, but he just can't do his job transporting glucose and other forms of energy because he's sick and tired of running back and forth. We've basically worn insulin out by accident. So when we activate our stress response too often, when it was really designed for emergency use only, our body uses so much energy trying to regulate our glucose as it shoots up from stress and shoots down from insulin that we become a lot more tired. And you may have noticed this in the form of fatigue. Relatedly, when we're chronically stressed, we aren't very good at regulating our emotions or perceiving situations with clarity. So we're more prone to common mood disorders like anxiety and depression. Remember, Glucose needs to be regulated not only in your body, but in your brain too. And when your glucose increases due to continually stressful events, this takes a toll on your cognition, basically your thinking and decision making processes too. So when you're chronically stressed, your muscles begin to waste away very, very slowly because you're triggering protein breakdown into amino acids to be used in a stressful situation. And if you're always stressed, these amino acids never get the chance to be built back into their protein form. Less muscle equals a slower, more sluggish metabolism as a result of stress, too. Have you ever felt like you were doing everything right with your diet and exercise and still having trouble losing or managing your weight? If so, that process is likely due to stress. So, to recap, we're living longer but with more diseases. These diseases are metabolic in nature, and glucose is really at the heart of them. Two, a mild amount of stress is actually good for you and improves overall health and performance. For example, higher intensity exercise causes glucose spikes too, and both cardio and resistance training have amazing benefits to our long term health. And number three, stress gives insulin the runaround through glucose roller coasters and ultimately contributes to diseases related to insulin resistance, like weight problems and type 2 diabetes. The great news is there's a lot you can do to manage your stress and buffer your metabolic health from it. Tune into part 2 to learn more. Again, I'm Dr. Sarah-Nicole Bostan, Director of Behavior Change Strategy at Signos. Subscribe to our channel for more on metabolic health, and I'll see you soon.